The winter of 1988 in Newton, Massachusetts, had wrapped the town in a brittle hush. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, muffling the creak of tires along familiar streets, leaving only the whispered sound of wind through the bare branches. In a modest, neatly kept house on the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, Fabian Morelli moved with a precision that made even the mundane moments feel significant. His mornings were measured, each step choreographed. The stainless steel kettle, the perfect swirl of cream in his coffee, the soft hum of jazz from a cracked radio. Every action was deliberate, yet beneath the polished exterior, a subtle tension lingered, an unspoken burden he carried silently. Fabian had always been disciplined. Friends and co-workers admired his punctuality, his seemingly unshakable composure. But behind the tailored suits and calm smiles lay a man who feared the unraveling of things he could not control. He carried an internal weight, fleeting anxieties about the passage of time, a constant questioning of whether he was enough, and a lingering worry that his careful planning could not shield him from the randomness of the world. These fears were quiet, often hidden behind practiced charm, visible only in the way his hands sometimes trembled when he poured a glass of water or the lingering pause in his gaze. When he believed no one was watching, he had a family he adored. Though his devotion was tempered by the unrelenting pressure he placed on himself to provide and protect. His wife, soft-spoken and steady, relied on his reliability, and his two children, unaware of the storm inside their father, clung to his routines as the foundation of their own sense of safety. Fabian's love was meticulous. It was in the way he aligned the children's shoes by the door, checked their homework with a quiet patience, and remembered the small details of their day before asking about his own. In these moments, his vulnerabilities seemed suspended, like fragile glass held in careful hands. Evenings were different. As the household lights dimmed and the laughter faded, Fabian often found himself alone with his thoughts. He walked the narrow hallway of his home, listening to the soft tick of the grandfather clock, feeling the weight of unspoken regrets. Memories drifted through him, the death of his father years prior, the lost friendship that still left a hollow ache, the fleeting chance at a career move he had abandoned for stability. In these solitary moments, Fabian confronted the unrelenting passage of life, a reminder that even the most disciplined plans could falter. On that snowy Thursday evening, Fabian prepared for what would be his last routine outing. He left the warmth of the house, his breath visible in the frigid air, and locked the door with the habitual click that had echoed through the hallway for years. The streets were empty, lights dim behind frosted windows, and the wind carried a subtle sharpness that pricked at his cheeks. Every step along the sidewalk seemed heavier than usual, though he could not yet understand why. There was a sense of urgency in the air, unspoken yet tangible, as if the snow itself bore witness to an approaching rupture. Fabian's disappearance would shatter this delicate balance. The world he knew, the home he had built, and the quiet routines that held him together would unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. Those who loved him would be left with echoes of a life that seemed so familiar yet was abruptly severed, fragments of memory and the gnawing ache of unanswered questions that it was not just a disappearance. It was a collapse of an emotional universe meticulously constructed, leaving only the cold, stark remnants of a life halted mid-motion. And in those silent streets of Newton, the snow continued to fall, indifferent to the tremor it carried through the hearts of those left behind. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? Fabian Morelli's life, on the surface, was one of precision and order. Yet beneath the carefully arranged exterior, it thrummed with quiet struggles. Each day began before dawn, in the stillness of a house that seemed to hold its own breath. The kitchen, lined with polished countertops and stainless steel appliances, smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon, the aroma lingering like a memory waiting to be claimed. Fabian moved through this space with almost ritualistic exactness, Yet his eyes often betrayed a restless mind. Scanning the room, as if seeking answers to questions he could not voice. At the office in Cambridge, he was the archetype of reliability. A marketing director at a well-regarded cosmetics company, he commanded respect with understated confidence. He carried himself with the elegance of someone who understood the value of appearances. Yet the meticulousness extended beyond image. It was a buffer against chaos. The office walls, lined with framed accolades and marketing campaigns, were a silent testament to years of ambition. And Fabian navigated these spaces as if each step were a stitch in a tapestry of control. But behind closed doors, he wrestled with self-doubt, fearing that the meticulous facade might someday fracture under pressure. Home life offered both solace and tension. His wife, Claire, understood the balance he tried to maintain, yet often sensed the quiet intensity that shadowed his smiles. Their children, ages 10 and 7, adored him, unaware of the emotional eddies beneath his calm. Fabian's love for them was intricate. He remembered the way his son liked his cereal prepared, the precise folding of his daughter's art projects, the bedtime stories read in voices that shifted subtly with each character. These details, so small to outsiders, were threads of connection he wove deliberately, a way to anchor his own fragile sense of self in the ever-shifting currents of family life. And yet, for all the care he invested in others, Fabian carried private burdens. There were nights he lingered in his study, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pressure of unspoken fears. Memories that gnawed at him, missed opportunities. A friendship that dissolved years earlier, a parent lost too soon surfaced unbidden. He feared the randomness of life, the unseen forces that could undo everything. And these anxieties, though muted, shadowed his every decision. Even the joy of small victories, a compliment from a colleague, a child's laughter, was tinged with the awareness that time was always slipping. That stability was always temporary. Fabian's weekends were attempts at reprieve, brief respites from the currents of responsibility. Snow-covered parks, slow drives through the outskirts of Newton, quiet Sunday afternoons with books or music. These were moments when he allowed himself to breathe. Yet even in these escapes, a subtle melancholy lingered, a fear that the life he curated could not withstand the unforeseen. He was a man perpetually straddling the line between careful control and the abyss of what might be lost. His emotions threaded with both devotion and quiet anxiety. Colleagues often described him as methodical, reliable, and unshakably composed. Friends appreciated his generosity and subtle humor. But those closest, Claire and the children, felt the fragile tension beneath the polished surface. The silent moments when he retreated into himself, unreachable yet ever-present. Fabian's life was a tapestry of love, responsibility, and restrained fear, each element carefully interwoven. Each day another stitch holding the fragile pattern together. Even the mundane routines bore emotional weight. The way he prepared breakfast, aligning cups and spoons with deliberate symmetry. The care he took in walking the children to school, scanning the streets as if ensuring some unseen danger did not lurk. The gentle but firm way he guided their homework all reflected a man both meticulous and profoundly vulnerable. Fabian's attention to detail was not mere habit. It was an attempt to stave off chaos, to anchor a life that sometimes felt unmoored from certainty. Within this delicate balance, the world pressed in quietly, a reminder that control was never complete. The weight of invisible worries and the anticipation of future loss created an undercurrent of tension. Fabian carried it with him through every meeting, every conversation, every evening lull. His laughter was real, but measured. His smiles were genuine, yet edged with the unspoken awareness of fragility. These were the rhythms of his days before the fracture, the quiet, emotionally rich pulse of a life meticulously lived, yet shadowed by anxiety. Each routine, each interaction, Each careful step was a testament to a man devoted to those he loved while wrestling silently with fears he could never fully express. The fragility was real, as was the devotion. And it was this combination that made what was to come so devastating. Not only for him, but for all who knew him. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The final days of Fabian Morelli's life were marked by subtle shifts that, at the time, seemed almost imperceptible. There was a heaviness in his step, a hesitation in the way he moved through rooms, as though the weight of invisible pressures had begun pressing harder against his carefully constructed world. He woke each morning with the same disciplined precision, but the coffee lingered untouched in his hand longer than usual, and the familiar hum of the radio felt distant, as if the music had lost its warmth. Small changes, almost invisible to the casual observer, but for those who knew him best, they were hints of an inner turbulence that he neither named nor shared. Work was no refuge. At the Cambridge office, he maintained the facade of control, answering emails and directing meetings with the calm efficiency that had long earned him respect. Yet colleagues noticed his gaze drifting, unfocused, fingers tapping lightly on the desktop as if seeking a rhythm to soothe his thoughts. The campaigns he once approached with creative vigor now felt like a blur of deadlines and expectations pressing relentlessly. There was a subtle tension in his posture, a tightness in his jaw that suggested a man bracing against forces he could not fully identify, much less manage. Even at home, the familiar rituals began to fray. Breakfasts were rushed, conversations with Claire more clipped than tender, and his children sometimes glanced at him with curiosity, sensing an energy unfamiliar and anxious. Fabian would pause in the hallway, staring at the wall as if listening for something beyond the ordinary sounds of the house. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. These moments of stillness were tinged with unease, a silent acknowledgement that something in his life, though unnamed, felt precariously balanced on the edge of collapse. One Thursday, the snow had begun again, a soft, persistent fall that coated the sidewalks in a layer of muted white. Fabian left the house that evening, briefcase in hand, scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, and with a glance over his shoulder toward the warm glow of the windows behind him. The streets were quiet, eerily so, the usual hum of cars and chatter replaced by the occasional whisper of wind through bare trees. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, though he could not have named it, a subtle foreboding that seemed to follow his every step. His coat pulled tighter, his breath visible in the cold. Fabian moved through the familiar streets with an unease that gnawed silently, a premonition he could neither ignore nor articulate. That night, he did not return home. The lights in the house remained warm and welcoming, the smell of a forgotten dinner wafting faintly from the kitchen. Yet Fabian was absent. Claire, accustomed to his punctuality, waited in the dim living room, her eyes tracing the shadows cast by the flickering lamplight, heart tightening with each passing minute. The children, sensing the unusual quiet, whispered questions that went unanswered, their small voices swallowed by the weight of uncertainty. The absence was immediate, jarring, a hollow that began to widen with each tick of the clock. Friends and neighbors would later recall the subtle signs. Cars parked outside homes with no one inside. Footprints in the snow leading only to thin air. The unsettling stillness of a town on a winter night. Fabian's disappearance was not violent in its announcement, but its quiet horror was inescapable. The sudden severing of a life that had seemed so stable, so ordinary, leaving only echoes of the man who had moved through these streets with such careful deliberation in the days leading up to his disappearance. There were small, almost imperceptible traces of his inner world unraveling. A missed meeting at work, a letter left on the kitchen counter with half-written sentences. The uncharacteristic silence during dinner moments that now, in hindsight, painted a picture of a man grappling with fears too private to share. These were the final gestures of a life poised precariously between order and disruption. The emotional tremors that preceded the unknown fracture. And yet, there was still a sense of hope, fragile as the thin ice that formed along Newton's icy sidewalks. Fabian's family clung to routines as a lifeline, believing he might simply be delayed, caught in the winter storm, or lost in thought on an unusually heavy evening. But the anxiety, unspoken and accumulating, was palpable in the quiet corners of the house, in the lingering scent of his coat, in the absence of the familiar click of the front door. Even now, looking back, the dissonance of those final days is stark. The juxtaposition of a man meticulous in his life, yet subtly adrift in his inner world. The tension between the warmth of family and the silent pressures pressing against him. These days were the prelude, a quiet symphony of emotion, tension, and foreboding that set the stage for the unthinkable absence that would follow. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The night Fabian Morelli vanished was unremarkable to anyone passing through Newton's soft snow falling steadily, muffling the world and streetlights casting pale halos on the deserted sidewalks. Yet, for Fabian, the evening carried a weight that no one else could perceive. Each step he took across the familiar streets was layered with a subtle tension, the kind that slips unnoticed until it becomes the defining texture of memory. His coat, buttoned tight against the cold, seemed heavier than usual, his briefcase a burdensome extension of the worries he carried. He was a man attuned to detail. Yet the routine of his evening was pierced by an undefinable sense of urgency, a small, insistent whisper in the back of his mind. The last known sighting of him was at the corner of Beacon Street, where the dim glow of a street lamp illuminated the frost on the pavement. He paused, as though listening to the world in its quiet winter sleep, his breath puffing wide into the air. There was nothing in the snow, no footprints other than his own leading away from the house. Yet the presence of something unseen seemed to press against him. Fabian's world, normally governed by order and predictability, felt precarious. The familiar rhythm of his life, the patterns of work, family, and home was suddenly punctured by the intangible, by a sense that the world held a danger he could not name or confront. For hours afterward, the house remained quiet, as if holding its breath. Claire, worried by the creeping lateness, called his office, only to hear the empty echo of unanswered messages. Friends who might have seen him returning for a late errand noticed nothing unusual, only to later recount the eerie, disjointed memory of a figure missing where he should have been. The sense of absence settled over the household like frost on a windowpane, subtle, slow, and chilling. Each passing minute added weight to the anxiety that had begun to gnaw at the edges of normalcy inside Fabian's own mind in those final hours. It is impossible to know the precise sequence of thought or fear, but the pattern of his life suggests he might have walked with an awareness of vulnerability that rarely surfaced before, a sudden, sharp understanding of how fragile the constructs of safety and routine could be. The meticulous man, ever in control, might have sensed an approaching rupture, a fracture in the fabric of the world he had so carefully maintained. There is an almost unbearable tension in imagining those moments. A man conditioned to order, moving through the snow, aware only of the faintest shift in the rhythm of his life. The first tremors of a collapse he could neither anticipate nor prevent. Newton, usually a haven of quiet suburban predictability, became a stage for uncertainty. The town, with its orderly houses and familiar streets, held a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the night itself had registered the disturbance. Witnesses later described an empty street, snow untouched, and a sense of something unspoken hanging in the winter air. The very world seemed to conspire in silence. preserving the echo of a life abruptly halted, leaving no immediate clues. Only the residue of absence and the cold traces of a vanished presence. Fabian's disappearance was not violent in the immediate sense. There were no screams, no frantic struggle. Instead, it was psychological in its devastation, the sudden removal of someone whose life had been so integrally woven into the fabric of family and community. The fear he may have carried, private and internal, now became a haunting echo for those who loved him. His absence transformed the familiar into something unrecognizable. Rooms that had held his laughter now held silence. The streets he walked so regularly now felt ominous in their emptiness. And the warmth of family routines became a reminder of what had been lost. This was the fracture of ordinary life. The unobserved collapse that leaves a void both tangible and emotional. Fabian's meticulous order could not guard against the unknown. The snow that night, soft and insistent, buried more than footprints. It concealed a man whose internal and external worlds had diverged in a way that left him suspended between memory and disappearance. Time became elastic, stretching each moment into a quiet agony. As family, friends, and the small town waited, unaware of the permanent absence that would redefine them in the hours that followed, the investigation would begin quietly. The search spreading slowly through the streets and homes of Newton, each step steeped in mounting dread. Yet, even as the town's routines were disrupted, the personal tragedy of loss began to take shape, the subtle, insidious realization that a life, once meticulously observed and understood, could vanish, leaving only the echoes of memory, fear, and unanswered questions. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. When the search for Fabian Morelli began in earnest, the quiet order of Newton was pierced by a new and unsettling rhythm. The frantic movement of neighbors, the slow trudge of officers through snow-laden streets, the hum of radios and the faint, anxious chatter of families drawn together by shared worry. Claire Morelli, standing in the living room with a blanket clutched around her shoulders, felt the walls of her carefully ordered world collapse around her. Every creak of the house, every muffled footstep on the frosty sidewalks, seemed charged with dread. She could not yet name the depth of her fear, but it pressed on her chest like the weight of the winter night itself. The town, usually so serene and predictable, responded with an uneasy mixture of sympathy and trepidation. Word spread quickly. A man, meticulous, reliable, vanished without trace on a snowy evening. Friends and neighbors retraced familiar routes, calling out into the muted hush of the streets, their voices swallowed by wind and snowfall. The weight of the unknown, the absence of struggle, the lack of explanation made the search feel less like a rescue and more like an excavation of the unseen. Newton's familiar houses, the glow of windows reflecting a normalcy now broken, became silent witnesses to a growing anxiety that permeated every hearth and hallway. Investigators combed the surrounding streets with methodical care, their presence both reassuring and alien. They spoke in clipped tones, noting footprints, interviewing neighbors, and cataloging the subtle details that only someone trained to observe would consider meaningful. But for Claire, each step of the investigation heightened her sense of helplessness. Questions went unanswered, trails ran cold, and the meticulous timelines that had once defined Fabian's life offered no solace against the suffocating void his absence had left. The routine of daily life, which had always been a source of stability, now felt brittle, as if each familiar touch, each ordinary object, had been quietly hollowed out. The Morelli children were held in the warmth of relatives' homes. But even there, the absence of their father hung palpably. Toys lay untouched, half-finished meals sat in the kitchen, and the echoes of bedtime routines, once infused with laughter and storytelling, now resonated with a quiet tension. Friends who had known Fabian for years spoke of a man who had always seemed in control, someone whose meticulous care and devotion to family had appeared unassailable. And yet, the disappearance revealed the fragility that had always lurked beneath the surface. A reminder that even the most disciplined lives could fracture, leaving behind only uncertainty and grief. As the investigation deepened, small clues emerged, though none offered immediate resolution. A neighbor recalled seeing a figure on the street at dusk, indistinct in the falling snow. A passerby remembered a brief glimpse of a coat flaring against the night. Each observation was catalogued with care, yet the pieces refused to coalesce into a coherent narrative. The town felt the tension like a living entity, a slow, suffocating dread that threaded through every corner of Newton. From the frost-covered sidewalks to the warmly lit windows behind which life continued, uncertain and anxious, the emotional toll on the Morelli family was profound. Claire found herself navigating between hope and despair, each hour stretching longer than the last. She replayed their last interactions, dissecting every word, every glance, searching desperately for something she could have missed, some clue hidden in the quiet folds of the evening. The children, sensing the shifting undercurrent, whispered questions into rooms now filled with silence. Every familiar object, the polished countertops, the neatly stacked shoes, the grandfather clock ticking methodically in the hallway became a reminder of absence. Each moment weighted with the invisible presence of someone no longer there, and as the investigation pressed forward, the town collectively braced itself against the unknown. The meticulous world Fabian had inhabited, the home, the routines, the predictable cadence of life, was now fractured. Newton's quiet streets and familiar faces were steeped in a shared anxiety, an awareness that the ordinary could be disrupted without warning, leaving a void filled only by questions and fear. The tension, the uncertainty, and the emotional unraveling of a family who had once thrived on routine became a narrative repeated in the town's hushed tones and lingering glances. In this space between search and certainty, between memory and absence, the story of Fabian Morelli's disappearance settled like frost on the windows, visible, cold and immovable, yet fragile in its transparency. The first days of the investigation revealed the emotional undercurrent that would define the entire case, the profound, human cost of a life interrupted, and a community forced to confront the fragility of what it had always taken for granted. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. Years passed, and Fabian Morelli's disappearance began to settle into the uneasy rhythm of a cold case. In Newton, the streets remained familiar. Snow still fell in winter, and life continued in measured routines. But a subtle emptiness lingered wherever he had been. Claire, now navigating a life partially defined by absence, carried with her a quiet ache that never fully diminished. Every familiar sound, the click of a door, the hum of a car engine, the distant laughter of children playing in yards, was tinged with memory, a ghostly reminder of what had been lost. The town, too, bore the mark of his absence. Each house, each streetlight a silent witness to a life interrupted. The investigation had slowed, files gathering dust in a local precinct, but the emotional echoes refused to fade. Witnesses who had once recounted fleeting observations now wrestled with the guilt of memory. What if they had seen something more? Something they dismissed as ordinary at the time. Friends and colleagues occasionally revisited the events, their imaginations, tracing alternate paths, asking, what if, in quiet, private moments. The uncertainty gnawed at them, a persistent shadow over lives that had been ordinary, predictable, safe. Claire kept the house much as Fabian had left it, each object a talisman of memory. The breakfast table remained neatly arranged, the living room untouched by the chaos of a new life, photographs carefully placed, shelves organized. She could not let go, not fully, Each day was an act of preservation, an attempt to hold on to the man she loved, even as the years stretched outward, blurring the details of the night he vanished. His children grew up with questions that remained unanswered, their childhood shaped by absence, their understanding of security fractured by a father who had become a ghost in the household. Occasionally, someone would step forward with a fragment, a fleeting recollection, a half-remembered encounter, but nothing solidified. Investigators revisited leads, their voices subdued, careful, as though disturbing the past too forcefully might shatter the fragile traces that remained. Every clue was weighed against years of uncertainty, each decision carrying the emotional weight of lives intertwined with the vanished man. For those closest to Fabian, every reopening of the case was a reopening of old wounds, a reminder that the world he had meticulously navigated could be pulled from beneath them in an instant. Newton itself carried the scars of memory. Streets Fabian had walked, the corner stores where he had stopped for coffee, the sidewalks lined with snow and maple trees, all retained a quiet tension. Residents spoke of him in hushed tones, recounting habits and routines as if keeping his presence alive could somehow summon answers. Children who had grown up watching the neighborhood shift in age spoke of a man who was more than a statistic, a life suspended in the collective memory of a town that refused to forget. The emotional toll was not limited to family and friends. Local law enforcement, tasked with the unending puzzle, felt the subtle erosion of certainty. The case files, meticulously compiled, were reminders of the human cost of disappearance, the vulnerability of a life so carefully ordered, now erased in ways no procedure could fully account for. Each time an officer returned to the records, they were reminded of the depth of despair that lingered in absence, the quiet powerlessness of failing to restore the normalcy that had once existed. It was during this period, in the shadow of uncertainty, that the community often posed the unspoken question: if you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The question lingered in conversations, half-formed and heavy, an emotional compass pointing toward unresolved grief. Memories twisted by guilt and speculation haunted those who remained, and even casual recollections became charged with meaning, as if the weight of time had intensified the emotional stakes. Letters, photographs, and old belongings became repositories of longing. Claire would sift through them in the quiet moments of night, holding each item like a lifeline. The children, now older, would sometimes sit with her, tracing the edges of images of a father they remembered only in fragments, feeling the ghostly echo of his care. And in the quiet corners of Newton, Fabian's presence persisted, not as a living figure, but as an emotional imprint, a slow, persistent ache carried by a town and a family that refused to let him be forgotten. Decades after Fabian Morelli disappeared, a breakthrough arrived not with fanfare, but as a quiet tremor, subtle yet devastating in its emotional impact. A single witness, long silent, stepped forward with a confession born of decades of guilt and fear. The words were measured, almost hesitant, as if the act of speaking could summon consequences impossible to fully control. The town of Newton, accustomed to the slow erosion of hope, felt the shock wave ripple through its collective consciousness, the revelation that the mystery had not been erased by time, only buried beneath layers of memory, denial, an unspoken shame. Claire Morelli, upon hearing the news, was caught between relief and dread. Relief that some fragment of truth had emerged after years of uncertainty, dread for what that truth would reveal about the final moments of her husband's life. She sat in the dim light of the living room, the shadows of the grandfather clock stretching across the floor, listening to the words that began to fill the void years of absence had carved. Every detail, carefully chosen, pierced the silence of her grief with both clarity and cruelty, forcing her to confront images she had not dared imagine. The revelation reshaped the emotional landscape of the Morelli family. The children, Now adults themselves were drawn into the intricate web of long-suppressed emotions: shock, relief, sorrow, and the gnawing realization of years lost to unanswered questions. Their father, a man whose presence had once defined their routines, emerged through stories and testimony as both human and vulnerable, flawed, frightened, and unable to fully protect the family he loved. The emotional resonance of this truth was overwhelming, not only for the family but for the town that had watched the slow unraveling of hope over decades. Newton itself seemed to hold its breath. Streets where Fabian had walked, intersections illuminated by the same dim streetlights, became stages for reflection and whispered recollection. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers revisited memories with a new lens, the mundane now loaded with significance. That casual wave on a snowy evening, that fleeting smile across a corridor, the ordinary gestures of life, all were now etched with emotional weight. Each fragment a clue in the puzzle of absence, finally illuminated for the investigators who had never stopped sifting through the fragments. The breakthrough offered both professional satisfaction and emotional burden. Years of meticulous work, re-examination of old files, and patient reconstruction of timelines culminated in a story that was as much about human frailty as it was about procedural closure. Each piece of evidence, each hesitant recollection, became a vessel for understanding the complex interplay of vulnerability, secrecy, and fear that had dictated Fabian's final movements. The quiet triumph of discovery was tempered by the gravity of its emotional consequences. Witnesses who had remained silent for decades wrestled with their own memories, recounting moments previously suppressed. Some admitted to fears that had kept them from speaking. Others, to guilt over minor choices that, in hindsight, seemed monumental. Each confession became part of a mosaic, a portrait of a life once taken for granted, now viewed through the prism of what had been lost. The emotional resonance was immense, a reminder that the smallest acts, observed or unobserved, could carry consequences that ripple across time. And yet, even in the revelation, questions lingered, shaped by emotion more than fact. The human need to reconcile the past, to understand why a life so meticulously ordered could collapse, pressed heavily on those left behind. Claire and the children navigated this space with fragile hope, clinging to the idea that truth, even decades delayed, was a balm against the ache of absence. A chance to reconstruct memory without the distortion of mystery. The breakthrough also prompted reflection within the town. The shared grief, the years of unanswered questions, the collective sense of helplessness. Newton became a repository for these emotions, a town marked by snow, shadow, and the quiet endurance of memory. And in the midst of it all, the question that had lain dormant for decades resurfaced. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? It lingered in the corridors of memory, demanding attention, guiding reflection, and shaping the emotional landscape of a community finally confronting the truth. The revelation of Fabian Morelli's fate struck like a quiet storm, penetrating every corner of the lives that had orbited his presence. The truth was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, insistent tide, reshaping memories and forcing the living to confront the emotional weight of absence. For Claire, it was a dual-edged awakening. The raw relief of knowing that Fabian's disappearance was no longer an inscrutable void, tempered by the grief of confronting the reality of how his life had ended. The man she had cherished, whose love had been measured in subtle acts of devotion, now existed in memory and testimony, reconstructed from fragments of others' recollections and the stark finality of evidence. The children, now stepping into adulthood, absorbed the truth in waves of sorrow and disbelief. The careful routines that had once defined their understanding of safety, the ordered breakfasts, the bedtime stories, the reassuring gestures of a father's love, were now seen through the lens of fragility. Fabian had lived his life balancing devotion and private anxiety, and in his final hours, those anxieties had intersected with forces beyond his control. For his children, the revelation reshaped their understanding of who their father had been, both in the small details of his character and the larger patterns of his final days. Newton, too, absorbed the emotional impact. The town streets, lined with snow and the familiar glow of lampposts, became reflective spaces where neighbors revisited their memories of a man whose absence had left a collective ache. Conversations once mundane were now laden with meaning-passing greetings, and casual observations were refrained. Subtle gestures that had gone unnoticed, now recognized as part of a larger tragic narrative. Each house that had once hosted fleeting encounters with Fabian became a node in a network of memory and mourning. The town itself holding the residual emotion of a life suddenly illuminated after decades of uncertainty. The investigators who pieced together the breakthrough felt a heavy emotional resonance, alongside procedural satisfaction. Every timeline reconstructed, every hesitant recollection recorded, carried the weight of lost years. The meticulous work of law enforcement became an act of emotional stewardship, honoring both the man who had vanished and the family left to navigate the silent corridors of grief. Even those outside the immediate circle, neighbors, colleagues, distant friends, felt the tug of closure and the burden of decades-long unanswered questions. The process of uncovering truth became a shared confrontation with vulnerability, mortality, and human fallibility. For Claire, the revelation was also a confrontation with the man she had loved. Fabian's meticulousness, his devotion, his constant balancing of private fear and public composure all came into sharper focus. She revisited the fragments of memory she had preserved, the careful arrangement of shoes, the alignment of plates, the quiet hum of jazz in the mornings, the soft insistence on order that had been both comforting and emblematic of his internal discipline. Each recollection, now juxtaposed with the truth of his disappearance, carried both tenderness and profound sorrow. The breakthrough also reignited old questions among the Benez, children, and the community. Could anything have been done differently? Could a subtle gesture have altered the trajectory of that night? These questions, unanswerable in their finality, became part of the emotional aftermath, reminders that closure does not erase grief, only reshapes it. Every familiar street, every childhood memory, was now colored by understanding, a mosaic of presence, absence, and human vulnerability. The story of Fabian Morelli, once suspended in mystery, began to take its full shape in the collective memory of Newton and the intimate recollections of his family. It was no longer merely an absence, but a human life viewed in its entirety, discipline and devotion intertwined with fear and vulnerability. A man whose routines were both shelter and mask, whose love had been measured and precise, whose final moments now emerged from decades of silence. Through the revelation, the emotional fallout rippled outward, touching not only those who had lived with loss, but also the community that had observed and speculated, that had whispered and wondered, that had carried Fabian's absence in the quiet spaces of their own lives. Each person's engagement with the truth was uniquely colored by proximity, by memory, and by the lingering shadows of unspoken fears. In the weeks following the revelation, the emotional landscape of the Morelli family shifted in subtle, unrelenting ways. Claire, once suspended in a limbo of hope and dread, now carried a sorrow sharpened by understanding. The months and years of silent worry, of pacing hallways and tracing snow-laden streets with anxious eyes, were distilled into a series of concrete truths that could neither be undone nor softened. She walked through the house with a new awareness, touching surfaces Fabian had meticulously arranged, tracing the outlines of objects he had left behind, feeling both his presence and the chasm left by his absence. Each corner, each photograph, each small, deliberate detail of the home became a repository for memory and grief, a testament to the life meticulously lived and abruptly taken from them. The children, grown now into young adults, wrestled with emotions that were at once complex and raw. They revisited childhood memories through the lens of revelation, understanding for the first time the hidden tensions that had shaped their father's actions and the invisible fears that had accompanied his love. Bedtime stories once read in shifting tones, the careful folding of school papers, the consistent rhythm of breakfasts and departures, all were imbued with deeper meaning. The safety they had once assumed was now understood as a fragile construct, a delicate web their father had maintained against an unpredictable world. Newton, too, experienced a quiet tremor of closure, though the echoes of uncertainty remained. Streets that had once felt empty were now imbued with memory, and neighbors shared recollections tinged with sadness, relief, and empathy. Conversations once tentative and speculative carried a weight of acknowledgement, a recognition that a life so ordinary, so meticulously ordered, could vanish, leaving an indelible mark on every person touched by it. Fabian's absence, once an open wound, began to knit into the fabric of the community's collective memory, a story of loss and emotional resonance that would endure long after the snow had melted from the sidewalks. For investigators, the unraveling of Fabian's disappearance was both procedural and deeply human. Years of painstaking reconstruction, interviews, and evidence gathering converged into a narrative that revealed not only the mechanics of the night he vanished, but the fragility of human experience, the intersection of fear, vulnerability, and circumstance. The breakthrough served as a reminder that the most meticulous plans, the most disciplined routines, cannot always shield a life from the unexpected. In this, the case transcended individual tragedy, speaking to universal truths about fragility, resilience, and the quiet courage required to navigate uncertainty. The emotional climax of the case did not arrive in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, cumulative realization that closure, though delayed, was now possible. Claire found herself revisiting old fears with a tempered grief, tracing the arc of Fabian's life not just through absence, but through the texture of presence, the careful alignment of objects, the patterns of his daily routines, the invisible acts of care that had shaped their family's world. In remembering him fully, both as meticulous caretaker and flawed, anxious man, she began to reconcile the loss with the vivid, intimate memories that had sustained her for so long, even as closure formed. The town of Newton remained sensitized to the emotional gravity of the case. The story of Fabian Morelli became more than the disappearance of one man. It became a lens through which the community understood vulnerability, empathy, and the quiet endurance of grief. Residents revisited their own routines, their relationships, and their perceptions of safety, recognizing in Fabian's story the fragile interplay between the ordinary and the unexpected. Each person carried the memory forward, a subtle but lasting echo of both tragedy and human resilience, died in the final reckoning. Fabian's life, his meticulous care, his private anxieties, his devotion to family, and the sudden rupture that ended his presence, was reclaimed from the void of mystery. The emotional weight, once dispersed in uncertainty and speculation, solidified into remembrance, reflection, and the delicate balance of mourning and understanding. Time had not erased the ache, but it had allowed it to settle into a form that could be acknowledged, confronted, and integrated into the living memory of those he left behind. The Morelli family, though forever shaped by loss, began to navigate a path forward, carrying the truth as both burden and balm. Each day became an act of remembrance, each memory a thread connecting them to the man who had vanished in a snowy evening decades before. The community, too, held the story as a silent monument to presence, absence, and the unrelenting passage of time. With the final pieces of Fabian Morelli's story revealed, the weight of decades-long uncertainty began to lift, though it left behind a residue of grief that could never be entirely erased. Claire moved through the house with deliberate care, touching objects imbued with memory: the polished countertops, the neatly folded papers, the photographs that captured moments of warmth and laughter. Each item became a tangible connection to a man both meticulous and profoundly human, a life lived with devotion, anxiety, and love that could no longer be interrupted by absence. In this reclamation of memory, grief and solace coexisted, a quiet duality that reflected the intricate nature of loss. The children, now adults shaped by both absence and revelation, navigated the complex terrain of remembrance with tenderness. They shared stories they had long held in fragments, piecing together the tapestry of a father they had known only partially, filtered through absence. Bedtime rituals, once suspended in the chill of uncertainty, were replaced with reflective conversations, acknowledging the love and vulnerability Fabian had carried silently. The knowledge of his final moments, though harrowing, provided a framework through which they could integrate their memories, transforming anguish into understanding and connection. Newton, the town that had borne witness to the slow unraveling of hope and the lingering shadow of unanswered questions, now absorbed a collective sense of closure. Streets lined with snow and maples became more than markers of absence. They were reminders of presence, of lives intertwined, of resilience in the face of fragility. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of recollections once half forgotten, weaving Fabian's story into the fabric of communal memory. The town itself became a quiet repository of grief, reflection, and the enduring human need to understand what had once been hidden. The investigators who had persisted in reconstructing the case also felt the weight of closure. Their work had not only unveiled truth, but it honored the emotional resonance of a life interrupted. Every reconstructed timeline, every recovered detail, became part of a larger narrative about vulnerability, devotion, and the unpredictability of human existence. Through their meticulous efforts, they had transformed decades of speculation and pain into a coherent story, offering a measure of resolution to those who had lived with absence as a constant companion. For Claire, closure was not a moment but a continuum. She allowed herself to revisit memories with a gentler hand, to hold grief and gratitude simultaneously, acknowledging the fullness of Fabian's life rather than only the void his disappearance had created. The house, once a silent witness to tension and fear, now resonated with memory and presence, a space where past and present coexisted in fragile equilibrium. The children's laughter returned to familiar rooms, soft and measured, accompanied by the quiet hum of remembrance. Newton, like the Morelli family, began to integrate Fabian's story into the ongoing rhythm of life. The town's collective consciousness absorbed the emotional lessons embedded in his disappearance, the fragility of routine, the unseen burdens carried in quiet devotion, and the enduring importance of empathy in the face of uncertainty. Streets, parks, and corners that had once been silent with worry now held the gentle hum of life continuing, informed by the knowledge of what had been lost and what had endured. The tale of Fabian Morelli, ultimately, was more than the chronicle of a disappearance. It was a testament to the intricacies of human emotion, the interplay between control and vulnerability, and the profound resonance of love and absence. Time, though it could not erase grief, allowed the fragments of memory to coalesce into understanding, offering both the family and the community a way to hold the past without being consumed by it. In the quiet aftermath, amid the snow-muffled streets and the carefully preserved household, the emotional arc of Fabian's life reached its conclusion. His devotion, his fears, his meticulousness, and the sudden rupture of his absence became fully visible through memory, testimony, and the enduring love of those he left behind. Closure was not absolute, but it was real, grounding the living in the legacy of a man who had navigated the delicate balance between care and vulnerability, presence and lost. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.